HOA kept sending cement trucks across my bridge, so I set a trap. They'd regret forever. They thought the bridge was just a footnote between my land and the lake. To them, it was a convenience they could exploit. A short, stable path for their heavy trucks. A place to run concrete mixers and water trucks at 2 a.m. when no one was watching. To me, it was the spine of everything I'd fought for. My property, my privacy, my livelihood. Every rumble across those planks was a threat. Every new crack that spidered across the road under the wheels was another insult. When the first cement truck came, I asked politely. When the second came, I called the HOA and asked them to stop. When the 8th came and left a fresh wake of gravel and oil that seeped into the riverbank underneath my bridge, they sent a letter blaming road maintenance scheduling and signed it with 5 polite initials and a stamped smile. That smile became my enemy. I've been called many things by the neighbors and the association letters: non-compliant, inconvenient, obstructive. All euphemisms for someone who wouldn't fold. They had a boardroom, a ledger, and the willingness to bend the law to their convenience. I had history, stubbornness, and a bridge I'd built with my own hands after the storms of '18 destroyed the old crossing. It took me a season to replace it, 2 seasons to teach the river where its boundaries were, and 3 winters to pack that wood and steel so tight the planks would sing instead of groan when someone walked across. The bridge had stories in it, old bolts that engraved themselves into memory. A plank that had a gouge the shape of a crescent moon. A stain from the first coffee spill after we celebrated finishing the job. My grandfather had said, "A bridge is more than wood, it's vows." I remembered that line every time some HOA van chipped at the paint. They started with small things, landscapers trundling across with mowers on trailers, emergency deliveries that coincided suspiciously with weekend parties at the board president's house, a steady stream of utility trucks setting cones and ignoring the loaded picnic tables of a Sunday morning. I logged dates, took photos, wrote letters. My appeals piled up in the HOA office, the way mail piles up in a house with no forwarding address. Read, set aside, archived. The formal complaint I filed after the truck with the cracked windshield. The one that sprayed oil over the board's old wooden railing and left a smear across my newly treated oak, got me a meeting. They sat in a circle that smelled of lemon cleaner and older money. There was a thin man with a permanent tan who declared himself the chairman, a woman who kept typing on her phone and never looked up, and a boy who still thought he could charm any grown man into silence. "You have no proof the trucks belong to the HOA," the tan man said, leaning forward like he was offering me a slice of cake. "Contractors use various routes. Your bridge is publicly accessible." The woman never stopped typing. "You want a construction log," I said. "I want the trucks to stop using my bridge without permission." "Access easements apply," the boy said, his voice syrupy. "We have shared access rights for maintenance and haulage. You should know this. We represent the community." They smiled the polite smile of men who had already decided. Their minutes framed it as mutually beneficial access. Their lawyers would call it rightful use. The way they said those words, as if they were reading aloud from a legalist's prayer book, made my teeth ache. That night, I sat on my porch and listened to my bridge breathe. The river whispered, and a single bird called the kind of warning a neighbor recognizes as the day turning. I thought about the trucks, massive, indifferent, hung like a threat at the shoulder of my property. I thought about the HOA letters and the smugness around their board meetings. I thought about justice and how it sometimes required redrawing the lines with one's own hand. Revenge, as my grandfather always insisted, is an art and a ledger. It is not hasty. It is methodical. It is a thing you plan like a garden, with soil tests and stakes, and the understanding that good fences don't make enemies disappear. They make them respect your boundary. So I started mapping. Not on paper, not yet. I walked the bank at low tide and marked the underside of the bridge with chalk where the new truck's heavy treads had started to dig. I watched the road from the oak tree bluff and took notes on route timings. The HOA trucks followed schedules. Mornings when the electrician would be at the president's house. Afternoons when the board's van would ferry members to the tennis courts. 2 or 3 times every week when the grounds crew came to replenish mulch. The pattern flexed, but remained consistent. I listed the trucks. A cement mixer. Number plate half scraped clean. That came from the north. A water tanker with a dent like it had been kissed by a rock. A flatbed delivery truck that always parked at the side of President Greer's driveway. They all had habits, as any living thing does. They all left tracks. If you read tracks long enough, you start to understand the animal. There was a time before the trucks where the bridge belonged to me and the people who'd learned to respect it. Then came the lawsuits, then the assessments, then the smiley letters that made insults sound like sunshine. My mother had an old saying, "You can't fix people's greed, but you can show them what breaks when it walks over your things." I built a photograph album of the bridge. Photographs of the original nails, close-ups of the bolts stamped with the manufacturer's code, macro shots of the grain. I collected odorless samples of the oil stains and put them in a plastic bag. I printed dates and times, attached them to the photos with neat strips of tape. When the HOA filed their counterclaims, as I knew they would, I wanted evidence so tidy, even a judge's pen would nod. I also practiced patience. Patience is its own weapon, and patience taught me all their rhythms. On a Tuesday at dusk, when the sky was the color of old copper, and the cicadas were starting their first slow song of evening, the cement mixer came. I watched from the kitchen window as it crossed, the drum turning like a slow, ignorant planet. The bridge held. The planks flexed and sighed, but did not break. The truck's driver, a man with a sun-furrowed face and tired hands, waved at the men in the HOA pickup, who waved back like board members, waving to an audience. The mixer entered the lake neighborhood and said nothing. I wrote to the board that night. "Your trucks have been crossing my bridge without permission," I wrote. "This is damaging private property. Please stop." They answered 3 days later with a packet thick with legalese and a mood like a reprimand. "We have the right to access," they said. "Your refusal is unreasonable and contrary to community welfare." I laughed until I realized I was already planning more than a letter could contain. I would show them contrary. I started small. I placed signs on my property, polite ones, well-worded, private bridge, no heavy trucks. Trespassing subject to prosecution. Each sign had a yellow ribbon tied to it, so it looked official. The trucks passed the signs like they were wind. The HOA claimed ignorance. The trucks kept coming. A close friend, Mara, visited that month. She's the kind of woman who can size up a problem in one glance and then, as if inspired, say the single sentence that makes clarity bloom. "You keep cataloging," she said. "You keep writing, but you aren't stopping them. How do you stop a company?" I asked. It was like asking how to stop rain. "You don't stop a company," she said. "You remove their desire. You make it harder than it's worth." That's when the idea, like a metal scent in the air, arrived. Not violence, not sabotage that would burn me in court. A trap that used their own appetite for convenience and their trust in practices they believed harmless. A trap framed in terms they respected. Engineering, logistics, reputation. The bridge had a weakness, not in the way a storm would split timber, in the way a living body has a tendon that takes the stress. The eastern abutment had been patched after the storms, but the soil underneath had become waterlogged over time, with the groundwater shifting its weight. It didn't take a concerted shove. only concerted pressure in the wrong place. Heavy loads shifted that soil more, and each time a truck came over the same wheel path, the riverbank sighed and moved. Microscopic, patient movement that would eventually betray a large weight. Engineers call that fatigue. I call it a slow betrayal. I needed to change the calculus. The HOA calculated convenience in time and money. I would make the calculus read differently. First, I consulted someone who knew things about weight and wood and bridges. A retired civil engineer named Ramon, who lived down the lane and wore his skepticism like a winter coat. He came with a thermos and a flashlight and his curiosity like a badge. "You want to stop them," Ramon said, tapping the pleasies. "But you want to do it legally, right?" "Legally," I said, "and without them being permanently hurt." He rubbed his chin. "There's a difference between breaking bones and breaking their habit. We can make the crossing look like a maintenance problem. Not dangerous, not criminal, just expensive," I offered. "Just inconvenient in a way the HOA board notices." Ramon smiled. "Take away the cheap route. Make them detour." We sketched. We measured. Under the bridge, the soil had small cavities where stone had eroded. With proper reinforcement, temporary and reversible, one could cause the board's trucks to find the crossing unreliable. The trick was to ensure first that any failure was limited to machinery and not people. But even better, to cause a logistical slowdown that the HOA couldn't ignore without admitting negligence. Call it tactical inconvenience. Ramon helped me design a set of maintenance markers, small, harmless alterations that would trigger a contractor's concern. Slightly depressed planks, a simulated gap in a no longer structural board, subtle rust on a bolt that suggested a deeper need for repair. Nothing that would compromise human safety under regular conditions, but things heavy trucks would notice and call in. The plan required time and discipline, and a patience like a cold-blooded animal. We gathered materials. We placed a thin curtain of fine steel mesh under the eastern abutment, anchored so it wouldn't cause collapse, but would cause the soil's load to shift it subtly when something heavy passed. We laid down slickening material, non-toxic, engineered, where the truck wheels always hit, disguised under soot. We removed a single, non-structural plank and replaced it with one that would settle fractionally under heavy weight. To the average passerby, it looked like a bridge in need of care. Exactly what our letters already said, but now the environment would echo the complaint in a language the HOA's team would understand. This is not safe for scheduled heavy use. We photographed everything. We numbered bolts. We recorded serials. We wrote down the exact composition of the slickening mix and the placement of the mesh. The law was a potential hazard, and so was ignorance. We documented like librarians cataloging evidence they might need in court or in a meeting room full of men in suits. If the board tried to blame us for sabotage, we would have a timeline showing we had given them notice, that we afforded them the opportunity to stop. The camera loves truth. I fed it everything. Then we waited, because evident failure without probability is worthless. A trap that doesn't allow the hunter to choose to walk into it is cruelty. A trap that tempts the hunter and then closes is justice. The HOA would choose. A week later, at the hour between breakfast and lunch, the familiar roar of a diesel engine approached. The cement mixer rolled in, heavy as a small planet. I watched from the blind of my kitchen curtains, a cup of coffee gone cold in my hand. Finally, the board would confront what they'd ignored for months. The mixer's front wheel hit the slickened board path and shuddered. It's not dramatic when it first happens. There's a subtle clunk, a missed gear shift, the driver's hands tightening on the wheel. The truck didn't stop. The driver, sure of a route he'd used 100 times, and a company that billed for speed and efficiency, kept going. The front axle dipped fractionally where the disguised plank settled. The truck trembled like someone who had felt a bee and decided to ignore the sting. The drum spun on. The pickup with the HOA logo didn't know at first. They followed, radio chatting about mulch and a 7 p.m. board meeting. Greer himself rode with them, cigarette tucked in the corner of his mouth. The same Greer who had signed the rightful use letter the week prior. He was pleased with the world because the world paid him deference. At the midpoint of the bridge, the truck encountered the meshed abutment. The mesh, intended to redistribute and momentarily trap the soil shift, moved. The truck gave a cough of unhelpful power. Greer's truck slowed. A man at the wheel cursed. They tossed glances at each other. The HOA truck pulled to the side. The cement mixer stopped halfway across. Not dramatic, not in that cinematic way you'd see in the movies, but in the way a man realizes his favorite route has become a problem. The driver climbed down, checked the underside, grunted. Bridges got soft spots, he said into his radio, with the resignation of men who think in schedules and not in consequences. Greer stepped out. He clicked his tongue with annoyance and looked at my property with the practiced disdain of a man who had never truly lost anything. "We need a report," he said, assuming me guilty since the place I refused to accept their trespass belonged to me. "This looks like deferred maintenance." I stepped out of the house then, gloves still on, a workman's towel slung over my shoulder. I walked up and across the grass towards the bridge, keeping my hands mostly visible, so they could see I held no firearm and no malice ready to spill. Mara stood near the fence, arms folded, as if she had been assigned the role of silent accomplice. "Morning," I said. My voice was calm in a way I felt, but didn't need to sound like. The measured voice of a person who's kept records for months. Greer adjusted his hat. "Morning, you repairing this bridge?" he asked, patronizing. "Yeah," I said. "Been saying it needs work for months. I put up signs. I called." He turned to his crew. "We need a structural report," he said. "We'll bill you for the inspection fee." "Bill away," I said. "But you won't be crossing it with heavy trucks until it's fixed." His laughter was a small thing that told me what I already knew. "You don't get to make unilateral decisions," he said. "This is a community access route." "Is it?" I asked. They measured with eyes and not with tape. The mixer's driver flicked his keys. "I'll call maintenance," he said. "We'll come back." "I'd like that," I said. "Please include photos of the exact axle points where your trucks cross." My voice was even. I slid them one of the envelopes I had prepared, marked with dates and photos, and the words, unauthorized heavy use. For effect, I slid the envelope with a deliberate slowness, so the leather of Greer's watch gleamed in reflection. They looked at the envelope like a live thing. Greer's face darkened a little, as if the letter itself were an informal vote they had to face. He called maintenance. Someone from their end promised to send an inspector. The mixer left and rolled away slower this time, like a wounded beast. Greer promised a test and a fix, the kind of promises people make when they plan to ignore consequences. That afternoon, I got a call from an HOA contractor. "We have to do an inspection," they said pleasantly. "We'll need a few hours to run diagnostics." "Fine," I said. "Do whatever you need, just not across the bridge with heavy loads." "Of course," the man said. "We'll take care of it." We both knew what take care of it would mean to them. The trap was working. That night, the board sent a terse email. "We appreciate your cooperation," it said. "Safety is important." On the third day, they came with measuring devices and clipboards, and men who had been paid to look at faults. They measured the abutment like it might produce an answer. They frowned and took pictures. They read the report like a prayer book, eyes moving quickly over the lines but stopping at what made them uncomfortable. "Deferred maintenance," the report said, "clinical and efficient. Bracing required. Bridge load rating reduced. Immediate restrictions. No vehicles over 3 tons until repair. Greer read the line and turned to me, like I owed him the cost of their readings. "We'll schedule a fix immediately," he said. "But until then," I repeated, "no trucks. The rating says no trucks." He sputtered with the slow indignation of a man who felt a rule should never apply to him. They grumbled and held their hands like purse strings. But they could not, in good conscience and on paper, keep using it. The trap had not broken their bodies. It had broken their narrative. Their convenience had become a documented hazard. That evening, when the sun boiled low and the world smelled like traffic and wood polish, I walked out to the bridge and ran my hand along the top of the rail. The wood felt warm. Somewhere, a board member was pacing in an office and calculating how inspections looked in the minutes they would publish to the community. It was not over. It never is. The board could sue me. They could claim I sabotaged public access. They could call law enforcement and make their versions of the story loud and prosecutable. But for the first time in months, my property felt like something I controlled. Mara smiled in the doorway, as if she had known it would work. "You wanted them to feel it," she said. "I wanted them to notice," I said. Same difference. We both knew the next act. Greer would not accept inconvenience easily. He would try to spin it as my obstruction. He would talk to the members, stir anger, and call for some sort of enforcement. He would bring lawyers, perhaps. He would do anything to reclaim the narrative that his suit and smile had always kept. But before he could, before letters were printed and motions were seconded, before threats were typed in office fonts meant to intimidate, the board made a move I had not expected. They came with a crew the next morning. Not their usual contractors, but men with heavy gear and the kind of trucks that make the ground vibrate from a distance. They announced over a speaker, and with the slow gravity of men who believed they were right, that they would temporarily reroute community haulage and immediately repair the bridge. It was the sort of action that could fix everything or spark the very conflagration Greer feared. They began to work. They set cones. They cordoned off the approach. People from the neighborhood came, curious, and the board's narrative trickled through, the crowd in a way that made their faces nod. Responsible action, while others whispered at the coffee shop about that stubborn neighbor who blocked community access. I walked to the edge of my property line and watched them set up heavy jack posts and cranes. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from a calculation I could not ignore. Speeding up their repair meant more chances for them to engineer permission through process. It also meant they would have to cross my bridge at some dangerous moment, perhaps in spite too. Bring in heavier machinery and materials. I hated the idea of that. My plan was to make the crossing untenable for their regular trucks, to push them into community meetings and bureaucracy. But now they were bringing tools that would test the bridge in a way that would end the standoff quickly. Either fix it properly and then claim communal right, or break it further and use that break as a justification to take control of the crossing permanently. So I made a decision. If the board intended to rush repairs on the bridge, to fix it in a way that obscured the record of neglect, and to establish precedent, I would force their hand in a different direction. I would make whatever they did transparent. I would bring witnesses. I would video the process. I would call the county inspector. I would make sure the record betrayed any attempt to hide negligence. They wanted to accelerate. Fine, I would accelerate scrutiny. I walked to my garage and took out the old camcorder I kept for storms. The one with the cracked viewfinder and the stubborn battery. I charged it and uploaded a fresh memory card. I printed signs announcing an independent safety watch and nailed them to my fence. I posted on the neighborhood forum, not with the passive voice of complaint, but with the steady voice of a documentarian. Bridge repair scheduled by HOA crew. Independent observation requested. Anyone with questions, please come to the Old Oak by 10 a.m. Power is sometimes about optics. It's about who is looking and the angle of their gaze. By 9 the next morning, there were neighbors. Some curious, some wary, some plainly supportive. A woman with a stroller watched closely. A high school teacher took notes on her phone. And an older man who'd once worked for County Public Works inspected the rig with a slow professional eye. Someone live streamed into the neighborhood group. Greer arrived with a face like a man who had swallowed a lemon and a clipboard that smelled faintly of new ink. They began to work. They lifted. They set. They hammered. They recorded their own footage. They sent out group messages. Repair underway. Thank you for patience. The neighborhood hummed with the idea that things would be okay again. At 11, when the crew turned to bring a heavy load across, the truck's front wheel hit the altered plank, and the slickened track betrayed the poor weight distribution. The machine shuddered, the load tilted, and a cascade of small things happened in a sequence you could slow down and study. A panicked shout, a flared hand, an estimator's calculator dropping from a clipboard. A bolt popped. Someone swore in the kind of language that reveals frustration, not just at a thing breaking, but at the absurdity of being foiled by what they had not expected. The truck didn't fall. No one was harmed, but the load shifted and had to be re-rigged. A crane had to be called. The day's schedule slipped. Greer's face, in the live stream, did the thing faces do when they age, rapidly under inconvenience. The board argued among themselves. Some members began to grumble about needless obstruction. Others, quieter now, read the community messages and realized their excuse. Emergency repairs was now a story with eyes on it. I stood with the neighbors, the camera in my hand, and I felt a strange satisfaction that was not cruelty, but the relief of someone who had set the world right by correcting its course. The trap had worked exactly as the engineer's drawings predicted. It had converted a habit into an audited problem. They would not like this. They would try to reassert control. They would spin stories in the meetings. They would send their lawyers. But for today, the bridge had spoken. It had shown them the truth of the damage and forced them to make a choice that would be recorded and watched. As the sun sank and the crane wheezed away with a tired load, Greer approached me. There were many things in his eyes. Anger, calculation, a thin apology wrapped in entitlement. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "No," I agreed, "but it's starting to be a problem you can't ignore." He nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll be in touch." "Please do," I said. He walked away. Beyond him, the bridge glittered in the evening light as if washed. Not just by river water, but by truth. I walked up onto it, set my camera on the rail, and filmed the board's last retreating silhouettes until the buffer light blinked red and the battery died. Revenge, as my grandfather said, is a ledger. It is not simply retribution. It is recalibration. Today, I had rebalanced the scales a little, but I knew this. The HOA had teeth that belonged to bylaws and lawyers. Their next move would be procedural and rehearsed. I would need to be smarter and more methodical, because once a board smells the possibility of being undermined, it gathers its arsenal of forms and subpoenas and files until the paper becomes a war. I had started the first act. The second act would be where the trap becomes a story that the whole neighborhood reads and the board cannot unwrite. I went inside, brewed another pot of coffee, and wrote out the beginning of the chronology I would file at the county offices in the morning. Each entry precise, each photograph annotated. My hands were steady. The plan had worked. The bridge had held. Outside, in the hush of night, the river moved on indifferent to human plans. But somewhere above the moving dark water, across the planks and bolts and the fine mesh we had placed, a new rhythm had started. The rhythm of them having to answer. The rhythm of accountability. The rhythm of a trap, not meant to harm, but to make the careless face the consequences of their choices. Tomorrow I would prepare for their countermove. Tonight, I slept with the satisfaction of someone who had forced a machine built to bully into a moment of respect. The ledger would be longer. The board would not get what they wanted without a fight. And I, stubborn, methodical, precise, would be waiting.